Welcome back to the Better Bookkeeper Show, where we get real about the wins, the failures, and yes, the whoopsies, the things that we do that we don't mean to do when we're running our bookkeeping businesses. I'm your host, Lynn Talbot, the Bookkeepers Coach, and I help bookkeepers build strong, confident businesses that they can scale, and yes, maybe even sell one day without losing their sanity along the way. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the messier side of running a bookkeeping business, and that's the mistakes that we make along the way. I have made plenty. Some I have learned hard lessons from, and others I've just learned and, I've just made a mistake and I've tried to learn from it. So let's be honest. Every successful entrepreneur, whether you're running a bookkeeping company or any type of company, you're going to make mistakes. And the most important thing, I think we would all agree, is that we're going to learn from it. And what I used to say to my employees, if they would come to me, they would be like, oh, Lynn, I forgot to pay sales tax, or I forgot to do this, or they made a mistake that I might catch or the CPA might catch. I never would get mad. I would just say, oh, okay, now what? And I would have them go back through what the issue was. And I would ask them, well, how are we going to solve it? And how are we going to make sure it doesn't happen again in the future? And then the employees, after a year or two, just came to me and said, hey, Lynn, I made this mistake, but this is how I fixed it. I emailed the CPA, we did this, and I've put this on my calendar so I don't forget to pay, sales tax in the future. I'm like, great. So making mistakes is going to be part of it. You're going to make mistakes. You've got to realize how to identify when there's a mistake. You might know when you get that angry call from a client, but you also need to know how to learn from those mistakes. And that's the biggest issue here is growth. If you're not going to learn from your mistakes, you're just going to get mad at the employee or mad at the client or push blame on someone else. You're not going to be a very successful bookkeeping business owner because there will be mistakes that will be made. So with that to do, I'm thrilled to welcome back George Wilson, the founder of Southern Payroll and Bookkeeping Company, for another chat. In our last episode, we dug into payroll, and today we're going to talk about some mistakes that he has so generously and bravely decided to share with us today, the top 3 mistakes that he's made while growing his business. So he's been in business 6 years. So about that 4 or 5 year mark, if you're there in your business or you want to get there in your business, that is the tough growth year. And so the 3 things that George had pointed out that we're going to talk about today are the mistakes in pricing. We all do that. We start out too low. The second mistake is the lack of oversight when your company starts to scale or grow quickly. Just how do you get a handle on that, and how do you create processes to manage that? And the third one we're going to talk about is hiring mistakes and sort of mismatches when you start hiring people and it doesn't quite work out. So welcome to the show, George. Tell us a little bit about you and yourself, and we'll get into the 3 mistakes.
Well, thank you very much for having me back, Lynn. I'm excited to be here. And I'm also extremely thankful that you decided to limit it to just 3 mistakes. Because I was thinking on my drive in this morning, I was like, this could be a podcast that goes on all day long. So I certainly have a laundry list of mistakes that I've made. But as you alluded to, I guess the key there is make sure you learn from those mistakes and improve going forward. But yes, I'm George Wilson, the CEO of Southern Payroll and Bookkeeping. We're headquartered here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And we provide payroll, bookkeeping, and advisory services to small and mid-sized clients. So thanks again for having me, Lynn. I'm excited to dive into these mistakes.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about pricing. You mentioned that one of the things that when you looked back at your 6 years of growing your business, that pricing was something that you had sort of struggled with, or you'd made some mistakes early on. Tell us a little bit about, your pricing model and how it's changed over the years.
Sure. So yes, one of my biggest mistakes, I could certainly argue this would be the number one. When we first started offering bookkeeping services years ago, part of my go-to-market strategy, if you will, was to price very low. I would do research on all my competitors, specifically within the greater Chattanooga area, but even some outside of that. And I'd get a pretty good feel for what they were charging, and I would undercut it, which on one hand, great. You can pick up more and more clients because they might have been paying so-and-so this amount, and I'm only charging that amount. But as you can probably guess, there are a number of negative consequences with that approach. A lot of what I found, we would end up working with companies who were just price shopping. And those are not good fit clients for us. If they don't see the value in our services, if they're not communicative, they just picked us because we had the lowest price. Those are typically not going to be great fit clients. Sometimes they are. It's wonderful when we just happen to be lowest price, but I got into a lot of trouble with that. And then as you start scaling more and more rapidly because of that, because we got the lowest price, it's just kind of a rolling snowball type of effect. One of the other issues with that being the go-to-market strategy is you'll hit a certain point, as you're well aware, Lynn, with the HR biz, as you were scaling the company, where you'll need to start staffing, and you need a bigger office, and you need more printers, you need more laptops. So as your expenses are growing, whether it's office, salary, everything that goes into being a business owner, if you've priced yourself so low that you can't keep up with those expenses, it's a much more difficult conversation having to go to the business owner, and either you're faced with asking for a lot more money right off the bat, which usually doesn't go well if you wanted to say, hey, by the way, I need an extra $25 per hour, thanks. Or you have to, if you're doing incremental increases, say 3% annuals now are standard, which great, they agree to that. But if you've already priced yourself so low, that 3% does not offset just general costs of inflation and kind of the hole that you've put yourself in. So that's, I could go on that pricing topic for hours, but I think that's kind of a high level summary of some of what I faced.
Right. Well, I think a lot of bookkeepers, when they first start out, me included, we do price ourselves low because we're like, and part of it is, well, I'm not big and fancy, or I don't really know everything. I'm just starting out, or I've been doing bookkeeping maybe for a certain company, and this was, 20 years ago. I was making $15 an hour, so wow, I'll charge 20, and I'll be super rich, right? And then you find out if you're just working from home, the overhead isn't a big issue, but it can become an issue once you once you start scaling, and you have to have supervisors and managers, and you're not just doing a one-to-one. You're charging the client 25 an hour and you're paying them 20, or something like that. You end up with this overhead that has to be managed. And I think you're right. When I have a client that is just shopping around, there's some telltale signs, and they'll when you say, well, here's the price, because this is what I would do when I was price shopping. I would try to see if I could get into their QuickBooks file. Then I could actually see what they were paying the other for the other bookkeeper or payroll, whatever it is that I'm trying to price, and then make sure that I'm in line with that. And if it's super low, I'm just like, hey, I can't do that. I can't do that. So, go on. But when you give them a price and they come back and say, well, can you do it cheaper? That's probably, like you said, a little red flag right there, that they're just looking for the cheapest. And I am not going to be part of that, continuing to lower my prices to fit someone else when it doesn't really fit my model. So for you as bookkeepers listening today, stick with what you know well, and stick with the pricing model that works for you. Don't let people come and drive your price down because maybe at that moment you're desperate to get a client, or you don't have the confidence you feel like you need in order to request that price. It's also easy to, kind of shop around and see what other people are paying, right? You could say, well, this is what it costs to manage, or this is what these different bookkeepers are charging per hour. Just go online and type in bookkeeping rates. You can see lots of different bookkeeping rates, and make sure you're staying up there, in line. So the mistakes early on, as George mentioned, can cost you a lot longer than just a couple of the first years. It can keep driving up, because then you get the reputation for being the cheapest one in town, or a cheap model. And then you might attract people that aren't really going to be really good, loyal customers. They may bolt at the first, raise or something like that. But George, would you say that when you go and raise your prices, do you have a big client fallout, or what happens there?
So that's one of the things that I think we've gotten better at as a company as time has passed and we've grown, because that was always an area where, from a sales standpoint, I wasn't really sure for a number of years. Like, do I do $5 an hour once a year? Do I do 10? Is it case by case? So what we finally ended up settling on is a 3% annual increase. One of the things, and you and I have spoken about on this topic prior, when I don't like surprises at all. If I knew what the weather was going to be 719 days from now, I want to know about it. So a client may or may not like a 3% annual price increase, but at least we've been transparent. This is what's happening, and they know it. So it's not a surprise. Now, whether or not 3% is the right number, I couldn't tell you for sure. It works for us, but again, it's because now we're closer to industry standard pricing. We're still a little bit under by intent, but not so much so where I put myself in a huge hole and that 3% does absolutely nothing because the hole is just getting deeper and deeper and deeper. So again, whether or not 3% annual is the right answer, I couldn't say for sure. But in my view, that seems to kind of be the happy median, if you will.
Yeah. So you hit on a really important part, and that a point, and that is that clients don't like surprises. If you can give them a fixed rate and just say, "Look, I'm going to do your books for 250 a month, and that includes a payroll with 5 people, or that includes three bank recs or three bank recs and this. You do the parameters. So with your pricing, I know with my pricing, I had a contract and it said, you here are the parameters. And I've looked at their file because a client will tell you, oh, I have very little activity in there. Like I only have 3 or 4 transactions a month. And you open up and there's 175 a month. You're like, okay, you might think that's a little bit, but that's a lot, especially if they're commingling or it's not something super obvious that they're doing. They're buying stuff from Walmart and I can't tell what that is. So I always get a hold of the file and then I will do a very specific contract. You have three accounts that need reconciling. You have up to 175, and I'll give them like 200. I'll say up to 200 because it might, that's fine with me. And up to 5 employees on this payroll platform paying biweekly. And then that's it. And that allows for scope creep, right? If the client suddenly opens a PayPal and then something else, they start paying by Venmo and they have a Shopify and then they start paying additional commissions, stuff like that. You're like, okay, this goes beyond the scope. Is that, have you found that? I didn't used to do that. I just would wing it, but now I do that. How about for your company?
Yeah, one of the things that we've gotten better at over the years is that initial onboarding and vetting process. So we have an intake form that will ask a lot of the basics, like what's your company name, address, phone number, etc. But then more specifically, part of our process as it pertains to the bookkeeping side specifically, let's assume they have a QuickBooks Online account. We will ask for access to that account. We're obviously not touching anything, but it's simply to pull a transaction history report where part of what goes into our proposal process from a quoting standpoint, we'll look at average transactions over the last 12 months because we have a large number of landscaping clients, for instance. So their transaction count in July versus January, two totally different things. So we intentionally look at 12-month average. We also look at the number of accounts, whether the bank accounts, credit cards, lines of credit, loans, etc. And then some of the other questions we're asking them on the front end are regarding how frequently they would like to meet with us. For all of our bookkeeping clients, I mandate month 1, month 2, month 3, we're meeting with them because, as you well are aware of, when those first 90 days are just so crucial, where you really need to learn the ins and outs of the client's account, their preferences and nuance, and vice versa. But we have a formula built into our CRM system where, based upon transaction count, number of accounts, meeting frequency, and there is room for a little bit of manual manipulation. Just if I have gut feeling that this client's going to be a very, very needy client and I'm going to be hearing from them every day. But for the most part, based upon actual data our CRM will then spit out to us with this internal formula. Here's how many hours a month we think that this client's account will take.
That that is great. So for you listeners, thinking about how to price, I will tell you that's probably one of the hardest things. It is the hardest thing that I tried to do. And I don't think I ever got it down perfect. I would change it and grow and learn. And most of the time I would learn because I would end up pricing people low. And then after that, I found out that they, were doing things or selling property or doing things that I didn't really know about, or they were commingling when they told me that they weren't, or they told me they would stop commingling and they still were. Commingling is a really
Oh,
big
they
issue.
didn't listen to your advice? I've never seen that.
Never seen that. Yeah. And so, commingling is a huge price increase. Like that's just, I tell them it will double the price because I have to stop at every single transaction and say, is it personal? Otherwise, I just go, oh, that McDonald's is a meal. And if it's because you're telling me that it is. So yeah, pricing is hard. And I think you just have to figure out a formula. It sounds like you've got a really cool formula of CRM where you input a lot of data and then comes out and then you've got some manipulation, like you're thinking, well, this client has a few exceptions or a few unusual things. I'm going to charge a little bit more for it. Or the client wants to meet with me a little more frequently than normal. You're being reasonable, and the client is they're a business owner. They're like, yeah, I get it. I'm using up more stuff. Well, let's move on. So that was our pricing, mistakes we made in pricing. And actually, I think there's a whole podcast on pricing we may have to do one day because there's all types of ways to price wrong and to price
Yes.
correctly. But the second mistake we want to talk about is just when you start to grow, your business starts to grow a little bit. You've got maybe a first 2 or 3 hires, and then all of a sudden your business takes off, and you're realizing that you need processes. And you had mentioned that one of the mistakes you had made was just kind of losing track or just sort of a lack of sort of oversight of what was happening with the company when it started scaling. Tell us a little bit about your issues and process through that time.
Sure. Yeah, candidly, one of the biggest mistakes I made, and I'm disappointed in myself for this, and I will be until the day I die. There was a period where there was definitely a lack of oversight on myself, as well as some of the other team members, employees here at SPB. What had basically happened, there's a number of factors that go into it, but as we were scaling, as you're well aware, Len, that comes with more and more growing pains. We, for a brief time, were offering, in addition to payroll and bookkeeping services, tax planning, tax filing services, which, as you can imagine, that is a massive time drain and stressor, especially between January 15th and April 15th or so. So I was spreading myself too thin, honestly, between sales, the other various roles that go into just being a business owner, having 15, 16 employees. I did not spend enough time on the oversight of bookkeeping. And what I found was on some of these client accounts, books were in bad shape, or the client was not being communicated with up to my standards, a variety of different things. And that was tough. That was a very tough learning lesson because at the end of the day, that comes back to me. That's my fault that the oversight wasn't there. Thankfully, through that process and what we learned, and I often say, I've learned way more from my failures than I have my successes. We now have a much better monitoring process where there are multiple people involved internally on the bookkeeping side in senior positions to make sure that those sort of things are never, ever happening again, and that every client gets 110% of our efforts, no matter how big or small they are.
So tell me about the structure of your business. How, when I started to grow, I moved a few of my bookkeepers who were like super bookkeepers. I had the most awesome employees. I moved them up to kind of managers. And I said, would you help train the new people coming on? Because you're like so awesome and they get me, they get what I'm looking for, and they get what the client needs. And so whenever a new client would come on, I would send them over to that team. They had like two teams. And so they had a supervisor, and that person was responsible for, again, either monthly or quarterly, just making sure that the books were getting done or answering the questions for that employee if they were like, hey, I don't know what I'm doing, or hey, can you pop in here and look at that? And they would meet weekly to go over their clients together. And that took the load off of me because I was meeting with everybody And when you get to 400 and 500 clients, you can't do that. Just like you said, you get you wake up in the middle of the night and you think, I don't even know what day it is. Did they pay payroll taxes? Is it Saturday? Well, if it's Saturday, I better get in and work because that's the only day I could get anything done
Yep.
was
Yep.
Saturday. So, your business can really take over if you're not prepared for that scale. So if you're a listener here thinking about, or you've got your bookkeeping company and it's starting to scale and grow, you might already be experiencing these growing pains. And one of the things you need to do is figure out how you're going to manage that, whether it's hiring leaders on your team and then working through something like a Zoho or a T-sheet to track the time. And I like to say, I wanted my employees to be 80 to 85% billable is what I called it, and I'm sure they have time, doing communication or talking to me or training, doing whatever. But if I would see an employee go down to just 50% time, I thought, well, what are they doing? And is there something that I need to do or correct them, or do they need more training? So that if you get a lot of employees and you have 2 or 3 that aren't performing, using something like a Zoho or a T-sheets tracking that, you'll be able to find that out. And that brings us to our next topic, our last one. We've only got a few minutes. We're going to talk about our hiring mistakes and our hiring mismatches. And if you've already hired employees, or if you've ever hired employees, you know that not all the time it's going to work out. I used to think I was a good judge of character, that I could just interview people and I would feel it and they would tick all the boxes on my little list. And I'm like, this is great. I would check a couple references. They're all glowing and off we go. Well, that got me into a lot of trouble because, as you know, bookkeeping skills vary from person to person, and even the thought of somebody coming in and saying, "Oh, I'm a bookkeeper. I've been a bookkeeper," and when you really delve into it, you find that they're really an admin assistant at maybe a real estate agent, and they enter checks and they pay bills. That's all they do. They don't reconcile. They don't do anything else. But they say they're a bookkeeper. And that really, if I'm not asking more specific questions, I'm not finding those things out. I do hire for certain personality traits too. I really need the person to be able to communicate with me and talk with me. They need to be able to look at me. If we're interviewing over Zoom, they need to be able to look up. They need to be able to talk and communicate and not feel afraid to talk to a client. I did have some employees that are terrified to talk to clients. I mean, terrified. And I would meet with them, with the client, and try to get them, to get over that. But I could also give them just the clients that I knew didn't need to meet with anybody. And if they needed to meet, I could do it, or I could do it with the client, do the talking. So try to help engage them. But I did have some pretty bad hires. I had one employee that stole a lot of my clients and just left and changed all their, the accountant to them and just left. And I didn't know anything about it because it was in my growth state. And one of the mistakes I made was not paying attention to all of that. So things can happen and you can hire a bad person and they can take your business down pretty quickly if you're not on top of it, because clients are going to know before you know, and they may not call you. They may just opt out. They're like, well, you should have known, George. You should have known, Lynn, that this person wasn't doing this right, or wasn't in my books, or wasn't reconciling properly, or wasn't doing A, B, and C. And, we're like, yeah, you're right. I should have known, but I was busy. It's hard work being a bookkeeping business owner. So tell me about some of your hiring mistakes or mismatches, just using general, context here.
Well, this the third mistake is actually directly related to mistakes 1 and 2 in my mind, between the lower pricing and then the lack of oversight. So there was a period roughly 2 or so years ago where I made a number of poor hires, specifically relating to our bookkeeping department, where I was really in a reactionary phase because we had been growing at the rate that we were. And I was already spread thin trying to oversee all these different departments and internal employees' personalities. And I'm doing sales. I'm trying to figure out marketing and advertising. Those were just a number of negative factors that kind of lined up perfectly to the point where we would go through an interview process. I was really fast tracking it. I look at their resume, this looks good. They checked off all the boxes. They've been a bookkeeper for 16 years. They're QBO certified. They've got to be great. And they're only asking for this amount of money. They're perfect. And I would subconsciously, now looking back on this years later, I was looking for reasons to say yes to them. And that is not the right approach to hiring. You really, in my experience, need to be looking probably first and foremost for cultural fit. I don't really care how talented someone may or may not be. I've had individuals that I've interviewed before, worried that because they didn't go to such and such school, I'm not going to hire them. And I tell them, well, I don't care if you went to Harvard Business School, honestly. That's not something that I'm looking at. I care way more so about your work ethic and your attitude. We try to hire internally for humble, hungry, and smart, which that could be a whole nother podcast and what goes into that. But I was unfortunately just reactionary hiring and then trying to convince myself that they're perfect. And then after the fact, it would be numerous months later where, there have been enough red flags raised where I'm kind of looking, what are they actually doing? And so clients telling me they haven't spoken to so-and-so in months. And I don't think that they've gotten their monthly P&Ls and financials in the last 3 months. What's going on here? And different factors. Sometimes they just weren't as good as advertised. Sometimes they were sitting there punching a clock and hoping I'm not going to pay attention. And they got away with it for a while. But thankfully, when we became more aware and cognizant of what was going on, we now have processes in place to not only monitor productivity and what you mentioned earlier, I call the utilization rate, where I'm also looking for 80% or higher. But really on the front end as well with the hiring, where we have multiple people involved. There's a couple different steps, sometimes multiple steps. There's a test that we give any potential bookkeeper as well.
Oh.
Because one of the other things that I've gotten tricked by, someone sounds great in an interview. They're saying all the right things, and I'm so wonderful at bookkeeping. I know QBO inside and outside, and then within a month or so, like, what's going on here? You're not doing the 101 of bookkeeping. So it's been a painful learning process, but we're in a much better position now.
Yes. Well, that about wraps our show up for today. And George, I appreciate you being here and talking about being, vulnerable and talking about the mistakes you made. I too have made all those mistakes and many more. And for our listeners out there, yes, you probably have made these mistakes too. You're probably nodding your head yes. But if you haven't made those mistakes yet, hopefully this podcast will help you think about when you get to those trials, you get to those situations, that it is something that you can work through, especially the pricing model that can get you in trouble pretty quickly for that. So thank you for joining us today. And if you like what you heard here today, click that subscribe button. And if you want more information about how you can avoid the mistakes we talked about, join our training circle.